It was just supposed to be another quiet day in the neighborhood until the president of our HOA decided to bulldoze my sister's wheelchair ramp. I bet she thought we'd stay quiet. She had no idea my sister isn't just any woman, she's the lieutenant governor of Arizona. What followed was a showdown she never saw coming. Power was abused, laws were broken, and a reckoning was long overdue. This isn't just a story about a ramp, it's about justice, resilience, and what happens when a bully picks the wrong family. So stick around, because what you're about to hear will blow your mind. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You don't expect a piece of paper to ruin your morning, at least not when you've made your coffee just the way you like it. The sun is hitting the porch just right, and your sister is finally sleeping in for once. But there it was, taped to our front door like a warning shot. Bright orange, bold black letters. Unmistakable. I knew before I even read it that it was from the HOA. I stood there for a moment, hand frozen on the doorknob, reading the word violation in all caps. Like some angry stranger was yelling at me from the paper itself. My stomach sank. I didn't even need to read the rest. I already knew what it was about. They were coming for the ramp again. I live in a quiet retirement community in southern Arizona, a place that promised peace and preserved neighborhood aesthetics, whatever that means. When my younger sister Monica had her spinal cord injury after a botched routine surgery last year, she moved in with me temporarily. I told her it wasn't even a question. I had the space, the time, and frankly, I needed the company. But mostly, I needed to be there for her. We'd always been close, and the idea of her navigating this new life alone was unbearable. Building the ramp was the first step, literally and figuratively. We did everything by the book, hired a licensed contractor, submitted blueprints to the city, pulled permits, followed setback regulations, even chose a neutral gray paint that matched the exterior of the house. Monica's physical therapist helped us design it for maximum safety and accessibility. It wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. Clean lines, sturdy railings, wide enough for her electric wheelchair to turn smoothly at the corner landing. Still, we knew there might be pushback. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood that welcomed change with open arms. But we thought with the right paperwork and a respectful approach, we'd be fine. That was until the letters started. The first one was curt but polite. Exterior modifications require prior board approval. Fair enough. I responded with a scanned copy of the city permits and a letter from our contractor. Then came the second one. 3 days later, structure must be reviewed for community compliance. Then the third, now with a threat of fines. The tone grew colder with each notice, as if someone out there was becoming personally offended by the very existence of our ramp. That someone, I later found out, was Mildred Avery, the newly appointed HOA president. But I didn't know that yet as I stood on my porch that morning, fingers tightening around the orange notice. Monica hadn't seen it. She was still asleep, and I debated whether to tell her now or later. She'd had a long week, between back-to-back physical therapy sessions and her new job. Yes, my sister didn't just recover, she ran for office, and one she was running on fumes. Most folks in this neighborhood didn't know she was the lieutenant governor of Arizona. She'd wanted to keep things low-key during her recovery, and I understood. Out here, she was just my sister Monica, smart, stubborn, brave, and lately, very tired. I took the paper and crumpled it into a tight ball before tossing it into the bin by the door. Just as I turned around, I heard the gentle hum of Monica's wheelchair. She was up. "Another love letter from the neighborhood?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her voice was raspy from sleep, but she still managed to smirk. I sighed. "You know it." She rolled onto the porch, glancing toward the street where, even from this distance, you could see a figure in a beige cardigan holding a clipboard, snapping pictures with a phone. Monica followed my gaze. "Is that her again?" "Yep, your favorite fan," I said. "Mildred the Menace." Monica shook her head. the corners of her mouth twitching into a smile she didn't really feel. She was trying to stay strong, but I could tell it was getting to her, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of not being wanted. No matter how accomplished you are, it's hard to be treated like you're a nuisance in your own neighborhood. "I don't want trouble," she murmured. "We did everything right." "I know," I said. "But sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough for people who think rules are more important than people." She didn't answer, just stared down at the smooth slant of concrete we poured with care and love and purpose. A ramp that had become a symbol of her independence, her resilience, her right to live here with dignity. And now, someone wanted to rip it away. You'd think retirement would mellow a person out, not Mildred Avery. Before she became the self-appointed enforcer of all things rule-related in our HOA, I barely knew her. She lived 4 houses down in a tidy peach-colored ranch with a pristine lawn, always wearing that same beige cardigan, like it was her uniform. I'd see her at the occasional community event back when the HOA still hosted things like potlucks and bingo nights. She used to be friendly enough, quiet even, but once she took over the board, something shifted. It started with the emails. She sent them out almost weekly, always signed. "Warm regards, Mavery, HOA President." Most were reminders about things like trash can placement and lawn edging, but her tone was always just a little too sharp, like she was daring someone to challenge her. Then came the clipboards. Every morning around 6:30, she'd make the rounds. Clipboard in hand, glasses on the tip of her nose, she walked the sidewalks like a general inspecting troops. She scribbled notes, took photos of anything remotely non-compliant, a mailbox a few inches too tall, a flag too faded, or in our case, a wheelchair ramp that disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. The first time she approached me, it was almost comical. I was out front watering the roses when I saw her coming. Her shoes made that stiff clicking sound against the pavement, the kind that said she didn't walk for leisure. She stopped right at the edge of our property, not stepping 1 inch onto the grass. "Good morning," she said, lips tight, like smiling would have hurt. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep it casual. "I noticed a structure has been added to the front of your home," she said, eyes pointedly avoiding the ramp itself as if acknowledging it directly would somehow justify its presence. "Yes," I said, "that would be the ramp for my sister." She blinked. "I wasn't informed of a board submission or vote on this modification." I nodded. "We have city permits. It's fully approved and within code. We submitted documentation last month. I'm not referring to city code, Mr. Holloway. The HOA has its own guidelines for external modifications. Section 7(4) requires that any visible alteration be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before construction begins." I took a deep breath. Monica had warned me not to lose my temper with people like Mildred. Well, we followed every legal requirement, and the ramp is medically necessary. "I understand your position," she said, in a tone that made it clear she absolutely did not. "But exceptions make enforcement difficult. If I allow one structure out of compliance, the neighborhood starts to look inconsistent. Inconsistent." That was the word she used to describe my sister's mobility access. It would have been easier to write her off as just another cold bureaucrat. But there was something deeper under Mildred's surface. She didn't just enforce rules, she enjoyed them. Wielded them like weapons. You could see it in the way she talked to people, never angry, never loud, but always with that saccharine edge. Like a school teacher, ready to scold you for chewing gum, but doing it with a smile. And she had backup. 3 other board members, all handpicked by her, never questioned a thing she proposed. There was Earl, a retired accountant who rarely spoke but always voted in favor of her motions. Then there was Marlene, who ran the neighborhood newsletter and was basically Mildred's mouthpiece. And finally Dave, the HOA treasurer, who seemed to enjoy telling people that's not in the budget more than anyone should. Together, they operated like a mini government with no checks and balances. And Mildred? She was the queen. What really got to me was how targeted it felt. Other homes had modifications, solar panels, pergolas, even a chicken coop someone had snuck in last spring. But none of them got violation notices. Just us. Just the ramp. One day, I caught her outside measuring it with a tape measure. She didn't even flinch when I came out to confront her. "Routine inspection," she said. "It's a ramp, not a swimming pool," I snapped. "My sister uses it to get to her car." She made a note on her clipboard and turned to leave. "It's important to ensure consistency across the community. Please don't take it personally." But how could I not? Monica, of course, refused to retaliate. "We're not using my position to get special treatment," she said when I suggested we let Mildred know who she was dealing with. "I'm not talking about special treatment," I replied. "I'm talking about basic human decency." Monica smiled, tired but unshaken. "Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she just doesn't understand." But I understood. Mildred didn't see a woman recovering from paralysis or a family trying to make things work. She saw a violation, an imperfection, something that didn't match the image she had in her head of what this neighborhood was supposed to be. So I started documenting everything, every notice, every photo, every uncomfortable interaction. I kept it all in a folder labeled Ramp Saga, part joke, part evidence. I didn't know what we'd need it for yet, but I knew something was coming. And Mildred? She was just getting started. It didn't stop after that day. If anything, Mildred doubled down. We started getting official HOA letters twice a week. One claimed the ramp violated community guidelines for color coordination, even though it was painted the exact same gray as the house trim. Another said the railing height posed a visual obstruction. One even suggested we submit a formal landscaping plan to blend the ramp into the aesthetic flow of the neighborhood, whatever that meant. Mildred had officially turned passive aggression into an art form. I wanted to scream, or better yet, knock on her door and give her a piece of my mind. But Monica, always calm, always composed, kept me in check. "She wants a reaction," Monica told me one night as we ate dinner in front of the TV. "If we lose our cool, we lose the high ground." I nodded, but clenched my jaw. The thing was, Monica wasn't just fighting physical exhaustion from her recovery, she was juggling back-to-back meetings with state legislators, writing disability access legislation, and overseeing emergency housing policy. All while this woman, this cardigan-clad tyrant, was trying to erase the one thing that allowed her to live independently. The irony? Monica never once brought up her title. Not to me, not to Mildred, not to the HOA. She was Lieutenant Governor of Arizona, but she refused to throw that weight around. "Maybe we should," I said one evening, after we got hit with our 4th violation in 3 weeks. "Just tell her who you are. Let her know this ramp isn't going anywhere." Monica gave me a quiet smile, that politician's smile that says more than words ever could. If I use my position to scare her off, what message does that send to people who don't have a title next to their name? I hated how right she was. Still, I wasn't going to sit by and do nothing. So I did what any stubborn older brother would do. I started keeping records. I bought a notebook and labeled it HOA harassment log. Every letter went into a folder. Every odd photo Mildred took from across the street. I noted the date and time. I installed 2 new security cameras, one facing the driveway and another toward the sidewalk, and made sure they saved everything to the cloud. And I started filming her. Whenever I saw Mildred creeping around, I'd walk out casually with my phone, recording without saying a word. Sometimes she'd pretend not to notice. Other times, she'd give me a prim smile, like I was the one in the wrong. Then came the morning I caught her pacing back and forth at the edge of our yard with a tape measure again, jotting numbers into her ever-present notebook. This time, she had company. 2 of the HOA board members were with her, whispering and gesturing toward the ramp like it was a crime scene. I filmed the entire thing from our window. Later that night, I re-watched the footage, zooming in on one of them pointing at the ramp, nodding solemnly, like they were planning a tactical invasion. It was absurd, but it was also starting to feel dangerous. By the end of the month, we'd received 6 formal violation notices and 2 written warnings about potential fines. Mildred even sent a letter asking us to temporarily remove the ramp pending board review. I stared at it for a good minute before laughing out loud. Remove the ramp? So Monica could just levitate into the house? I showed it to her, expecting at least a spark of outrage. She just shook her head and said, "Keep it. We'll need it for the file." She was right. But something in me snapped that day. It wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about dignity. About the quiet way people in power try to bully others into submission without ever raising their voices. I started reaching out quietly. I emailed a disability rights lawyer Monica had once worked with. I spoke to a city building inspector who reviewed our permits. I even contacted a journalist friend from my college days and told him, hypothetically, what might happen if an HOA went after the wrong person for the wrong reasons. He replied, "Sounds like a story waiting to explode," but Monica still didn't want to go public. Not yet. "We do this the right way," she said. "No shortcuts, no press conference, just truth, evidence, and the law." I admired her restraint, but I could feel something brewing. A shift in the air. Something was coming, and I didn't know if we were ready. Then, one Sunday morning, I caught something new. It was early, around 6:15. I'd stepped out onto the porch with my coffee, more out of habit than anything. That's when I noticed a beige car parked 2 houses down, its engine running. At first I thought it might be a delivery, but then I saw Mildred dressed, as usual, like she was headed to church, walking slowly toward the car, with 2 men in button-down shirts. They weren't from the neighborhood. One had a briefcase. The other carried a rolled-up blueprint under his arm. They stood at the edge of our lawn for several minutes, gesturing toward the ramp. One of the men took out a small notepad. Mildred nodded along, pointing and occasionally tapping her notebook like she was giving instructions. I filmed it all from the edge of our porch, my coffee cooling in my hands. That evening, we received no letter, no warning, nothing, which is why I knew without a doubt that something was about to happen. I woke up to the sound of engines, not the usual morning hum of delivery vans or passing cars, but something low and guttural, heavy and mechanical. It took me a moment to place it. When I realized what it was, my stomach dropped before my feet even hit the floor. A bulldozer. I sprinted to the front window, heart pounding, and there it was. A massive, bright yellow bulldozer, idling in our driveway like it belonged there. 2 men in neon vests stood nearby, holding clipboards and measuring wheels. And standing right in the middle of our front yard, like the queen of a chessboard, was Mildred Avery. She looked exactly the same as always, beige cardigan, pressed slacks, pearl earrings, but something about her posture was different. Triumphant, like she'd been waiting for this moment and was savoring every second. I grabbed my phone and hit record as I threw open the door. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, my voice cracking halfway through the sentence. Mildred turned, lips curled into her usual condescending smile. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway. So glad you're home. What is this? Why is there a bulldozer in my driveway?" She held up a folder like it was a badge of honor. "This is an emergency removal order from the HOA board. The structure in question," she gestured casually to the ramp, "has been deemed non-compliant and poses a visual and safety hazard to the community." "You're calling a wheelchair ramp a safety hazard?" I said, barely believing I had to say those words out loud. "It was never properly approved through our architectural review committee," she replied. "We have no record of a board vote, and as such, we must enforce the guidelines outlined in Section 7.4 of the HOA Charter. We have city permits," I shouted, waving my phone at her like it was a weapon. "We followed every legal requirement, every inspection passed, every code met. The HOA operates independently of municipal code," she said, her voice syrupy and smug. Our responsibility is to maintain property values and neighborhood harmony. This ramp undermines both. I looked toward the bulldozer. One of the workers was now unrolling bright orange cones around the edges of the driveway, marking off the area like a construction site. "This is illegal," I said, louder now. "You can't just destroy someone's private property. This is a medically necessary structure. You are violating the Americans with Disabilities Act." She didn't flinch. "Notice was sent 3 weeks ago, via certified mail," she said, flipping to another page in her folder. "We have a signed delivery receipt." I stepped forward, heart thudding. "That signature isn't mine. That's not even close. You'll have to take that up with the mail carrier," she said, turning away. I could barely think straight. I called Monica's number straight to voicemail. Of course, she was scheduled to be in a closed-door budget meeting all morning. I tried her assistant, her chief of staff. No answer. I texted them all, sent photos, called again, but no one picked up. The sound of the bulldozer's engine revving shook me to the core. The two workers moved slowly, double-checking their measurements. One of them looked uneasy, pointing toward the ramp and whispering to the other. I could tell they weren't fully on board with what they were doing, but they hadn't stopped. "Don't do this," I said, my voice raw. "You're making a huge mistake." Mildred turned back to me, eyes cold behind her glasses. "The mistake," she said, "was allowing this violation to remain unaddressed for so long. Sometimes rules must be enforced, Mr. Holloway, even when they're inconvenient." The blade of the bulldozer began to lower. I stepped back instinctively, raising my phone to continue filming. The steel scraped against concrete with a horrible, screeching grind. It hit the edge of the ramp just lightly at first, but enough to crack the paint and shift the front platform. The structure groaned like it was in pain. I felt sick. Behind me, a few neighbors began stepping out of their homes, drawn by the noise. Mr. Davis across the street had a confused look on his face. The elderly Rodriguez couple appeared on their porch, whispering urgently. I saw Miss S. Chen lower her gardening gloves and squint toward the driveway. They all looked stunned. None of them had any idea this was coming. Just like me, the bulldozer inched forward, scraping another chunk of the ramp. Concrete splintered and flew in small clouds of dust. I kept filming, fingers shaking but steady enough to get everything. And then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Monica's head of security. "Stay calm. Help is 3 minutes out. Keep recording." I almost dropped the phone in relief. I looked up at Mildred, still barking orders like she was directing a symphony. She had no idea what was coming. And neither did the men in suits I now noticed, arriving at the end of the block, 3 black SUVs turning onto our street. No headlights, moving quickly but quietly. Behind them, the wail of sirens began to rise in the distance. It was happening. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just filmed the ramp being torn apart, filmed the neighbors gathering, filmed Mildred clutching her violation notices like she'd just won some kind of war. She was so focused on destroying what she called an eyesore that she didn't even notice when the SUVs rolled to a stop in front of our house. Didn't notice when half a dozen state troopers stepped out and scanned the crowd. Didn't notice when the lead security officer opened the door to the center vehicle and my sister, Monica Holloway, Lieutenant Governor of Arizona, emerged in her wheelchair, dressed in a navy blue blazer with the state seal shining on the lapel. The crowd gasped. Mildred finally turned, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw her mask crack. She blinked once, twice. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. Monica wheeled forward, flanked by 2 officers. She looked calm, professional, composed, but her eyes burned with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger, not even sadness, righteous fire. And in that moment, I knew the real reckoning was just beginning. The dust hadn't even settled when the neighborhood started to change. It was subtle at first, just a few extra faces appearing at windows, blinds shifting aside, porch doors creaking open. People weren't hiding anymore, they were watching. The moment Monica rolled out of that SUV and addressed Mildred in front of the entire street, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, the fear that had kept everyone silent for so long seemed to crack. The ramp might have been in ruins, but the illusion that Mildred was untouchable had been shattered. After the security team moved in and Mildred was pulled aside for questioning, Monica turned to the growing group of neighbors and introduced herself not as a politician, not even as a victim, but as a neighbor. Her voice was calm, unwavering. "This isn't just about a ramp," she said. "This is about what kind of community we want to live in, where we respect each other, where we make space for people, not tear down what helps them live." And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen in this neighborhood since Monica moved in, people nodding, not out of obligation, but understanding. That night, after the state troopers left and the black SUVs disappeared down the street, our front yard turned into something like an impromptu town hall. People gathered around the remnants of the destroyed ramp, talking in low voices, shaking their heads, asking questions. Monica answered each one patiently, still sitting in her wheelchair, exhausted but grounded. I stood next to her, unsure of what to say, until Mr. Rodriguez shuffled over with a folder in hand. He looked down at the broken concrete, then at Monica. "She fined me last year," he said quietly, "for the lift I had installed for my father. He was a veteran, couldn't walk anymore." He handed her the folder documentation, photos, copies of the violation letters. Mrs. Chen from across the street came next. She made me tear up my medical herb garden, said it was unsightly. I had arthritis. The herbs helped. Then came the Bakers, a quiet family who lived 2 blocks over. Their son has autism. They'd installed a small, sensory-friendly play area in their backyard, nothing loud, nothing flashy. Mildred fined them twice and threatened to report them for violating structure spacing guidelines. As the stories came pouring out, so did the frustration. People had been angry, but they'd also been afraid. Mildred ran the HOA like it was her own private kingdom, and no one dared speak up. Until now. The next morning, things picked up steam. I woke up to find 3 neighbors standing at the edge of our yard, holding toolboxes. "We can help clean up," one of them said. That ramp was beautiful. It shouldn't have been destroyed. I nearly choked on my coffee. A few hours later, a retired carpenter from down the block dropped off sketches for a new design. "Better than before," he said, "if you're up for it." Even the teenage twins from the corner house came by with their dad and offered to paint once the new ramp was up. It was surreal. By midday, our house felt like a hub of activity. Monica sat at a folding table set up on the lawn, collecting statements and helping neighbors write formal complaints. A woman from a disability rights nonprofit had driven in from Tucson after seeing the news. She brought flyers, legal guides, and a fiery passion for holding HOAs accountable. What was once a quiet cul-de-sac was now alive with purpose. Conversations that used to stop at pleasantries niste, were now full of vulnerability and shared experience. We learned that almost a dozen households had been fined under questionable circumstances. One man said he paid over $1,500 in penalties last year alone, half of it for paint inconsistencies. The atmosphere had shifted. No more looking over shoulders. No more whispering about the HOA like it was some faceless monster. Mildred had a name now, and more importantly, she had consequences. That evening, I sat on the porch beside Monica as the sun dipped behind the roofs. The front yard smelled like fresh-cut lumber and sawdust. Someone had brought lemonade. 2 kids played tag in the street. For once, nobody was yelling about property values. Monica leaned back in her chair, letting the breeze brush over her face. "I never imagined it would happen like this," she said. I laughed. "You mean an uprising sparked by a ramp and a bulldozer?" She smirked. "I mean people actually listening." I looked out at the crowd, neighbors talking, helping, connecting. Mildred's house was dark. Her car hadn't moved all day. "She had them afraid," I said. "Now they're just mad." "Sometimes anger is good," Monica replied. "It gets things moving. We watched as Mr. Rodriguez helped one of the volunteers measure the slope of the new ramp base. Across the lawn, Mrs. Chen was showing a group of people how to grow rosemary in portable planters. The bakers had brought their son over to meet the nonprofit rep, who promised to connect them to legal aid. And me? I just kept watching, taking it in, trying to remember every face, every voice, every spark of connection. Because I knew this wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. This was about building something new. The morning after the bulldozing, the energy on our street was electric buzzing, tense, and thick with anticipation. The neighborhood felt like it had collectively taken a deep breath and was waiting to see what came next. I knew Monica was planning something, but she hadn't said much. She'd spent most of the night on her laptop, making calls, typing, organizing files. I offered to help, but she waved me off with a soft smile. "This part I need to do myself," she said. So I just did what I could, cleaned up debris from the destroyed ramp, made coffee, kept people updated. The neighbors kept stopping by, asking questions, sharing more stories of how Mildred had overstepped. It felt like the whole street was slowly waking up after years of silence. Around 10 in the morning, a black SUV pulled up again, Monica's security team. But this time, they weren't just here for protection. They started setting up a small podium on our front lawn, right where the ramp used to be. A microphone, a backdrop with the state seal. One of them unrolled a banner that simply read, "Equal access, equal dignity." By 11 o'clock, the local news vans were rolling in. Word had spread fast. What happened to our ramp had already gone viral online. Clips of the bulldozer, my live stream, Monica's arrival, people were reposting it everywhere. I even saw it on a national morning show. It was surreal watching your own driveway on TV, narrated by someone who had no idea that the guy behind the phone was just trying to stop his sister from getting steamrolled, literally. By noon, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors, reporters, activists, curious folks from surrounding communities. Some brought signs. Others brought lawn chairs and umbrellas. It felt more like a rally than a press conference. I recognized some of the faces from the previous day, Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Chen, the bakers. But there were new faces, too. Younger people with cameras, older couples holding hands. A teenage girl rolled up in her own wheelchair with her mom, whispering that she had to be here to see this. Then Monica rolled out from the front door. She wasn't wearing her usual blazer. Today, she wore the one with the gold trim, the one she saves for legislative sessions and policy announcements. The Arizona state pin glinted in the sun, and her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun. Her expression was calm but firm, controlled power. It was the Monica I had seen at rallies and debates, the one I knew could command a room with just her voice. She rolled to the mic, adjusted it slightly, and looked out over the crowd. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady, filling the space. "My name is Monica Holloway. I am the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Arizona. And yes, I live here." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some gasped, others nodded, as if everything had just clicked into place. I moved in with my brother after a spinal cord injury left me temporarily unable to live independently. We built a ramp, we followed the law, we secured permits. And yet, that ramp was destroyed without notice, without consent, and in direct violation of federal protections. She paused. I chose not to disclose my position before now because I believe no one should need a title or government badge to deserve respect and dignity in their own neighborhood. There was a murmur of agreement in the crowd. I glanced over to where Mildred was standing, not in the front, not at the podium, but off to the side, half shielded behind a tree. She looked pale, like she had aged 10 years overnight. Her arms were crossed, lips pursed, watching silently. "But," Monica continued, "since my title was ignored when it was unknown, I'm invoking it now not for myself, but for every person who's been bullied, harassed, or marginalized by unchecked HOA power." She motioned to her assistant, who stepped forward and handed her a thick binder. "This is a comprehensive review of the HOA's violations, not just against me, but against numerous residents here. discriminatory practices, misuse of funds, and actions that contradict both state and federal law. Gasps from the audience. Someone in the back started clapping. Others followed. "And it doesn't stop here," she added. "I've drafted legislation already in review that will increase oversight of HOAs across the state. It will include stronger protections for people with disabilities, financial transparency requirements, and a clear legal path for residents to challenge abuses of power." The applause swelled. I turned my head and caught sight of Mildred's HOA board members. They weren't standing near her. In fact, two of them were slowly backing away, their expressions unreadable. One of them looked visibly shaken. Monica held up a photo of our ramp before it was destroyed. Behind her, the broken remains were still scattered on the grass. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This ramp was more than concrete and metal. It was freedom. And its destruction wasn't just a violation of code, it was a violation of values. When she finished speaking, the crowd erupted. People surged forward, not in panic, but with energy, a shared sense of purpose. Reporters asked questions. Microphones were thrust forward. But Monica waved them off politely and rolled over to the side of the lawn, where a group of residents had gathered with handwritten stories and complaint forms. She listened to each one. Meanwhile, Mildred tried to slip away unnoticed, but someone saw her. A young reporter with a handheld mic and camera crew spotted her and called out, "Miss Avery, would you like to comment on the bulldozing of a state official's accessibility ramp?" She froze. For a second, I saw her consider answering, but then she just turned and walked briskly toward her house. The door slammed shut. No one followed her. Instead, they followed Monica. What came next was less like a press conference and more like a courtroom. After Monica finished her speech and stepped away from the podium, the air didn't settle. It thickened. You could feel something shifting not just in the crowd, but in the ground beneath our feet. It was as if everyone realized this wasn't just one neighborly spat gone too far. This was something bigger, systemic, deep-rooted. And Monica wasn't just here to talk, she was here to expose. As the applause died down, her assistant stepped forward and handed out stapled packets to members of the press. Each packet contained over 50 pages of documentation. I'd seen her up until 2 in the morning compiling it all, every HOA violation, every contradictory clause in the community charter, every shady transaction Mildred had signed off on in the past 3 years. I hadn't even known the half of it. The packet wasn't just about the ramp. It was about everything that led up to it, the pattern of selective enforcement, the disproportionate targeting of elderly, disabled, and immigrant residents, and the way fines were levied without hearings or recourse. But the most damning part was at the back of the report, the financial audit. Turns out, Mildred had been approving expenditures from the HOA fund under vague labels like common area improvements and aesthetic restoration. But the receipts told another story: custom landscaping at her house, a brand new driveway, high-end patio furniture listed as community seating, over $30,000 spent, over 2 years, and barely any of it made it outside her own property line. I saw the moment the reporter from Channel 4 realized what she was holding. Her eyes widened, and she turned to her cameraman, whispering quickly before lifting her mic again. They weren't here for a feel-good accessibility story anymore. This had just become a political scandal. Across the lawn, Mildred stood frozen in place. She hadn't left yet. Maybe she thought she still had time to defend herself. Maybe she thought no one would believe Monica. Or maybe, like so many people who get used to power, she thought she was untouchable. She wasn't. Monica didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned back toward the crowd and said, "This is what happens when there's no oversight. When a system meant to support a community becomes a weapon for a few." One of the state investigators stepped forward, then a serious-looking man in a gray blazer with a badge clipped to his belt. He approached. Mildred slowly, respectfully, but firmly. "Miss S. Avery," he said, "we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding these documents and your role in recent HOA decisions." Her face went sheet white. She stammered something about fabricated documents and political theatrics, but no one was listening anymore. Her words had lost their weight. Her power had evaporated. The investigator gestured for her to accompany him. As she walked past Monica, she glanced down at the ramp debris, then up at her. I don't know what she expected, sympathy, maybe? Mercy? But Monica just looked at her with the same expression she'd worn during every debate. I'd seen her in measured, calm, steady. "You didn't just break the law," Monica said quietly. "You broke trust." That was the moment I knew Mildred's reign was over. But Monica wasn't done yet. Back at the podium, she held up a copy of the HOA charter. "We've reviewed this," she said, line by line. "And do you know what we found?" She flipped to a bookmarked page. There's no record of Mildred Avery ever being legally elected as HOA president. The last official president moved away mid-term. The board never held a formal vote. She just stepped in. A gasp ran through the crowd. This isn't just negligence. It's deliberate manipulation of a system that was supposed to protect residents. And it's gone on long enough. Someone started clapping, then another. And within seconds, the whole lawn was on their feet, cheering, whistling, calling Monica's name. I looked around and saw people I'd never seen speak a word at HOA meetings, Mr. Jenkins. The Bakers, even grumpy old Harold from the end of the block, smiling, clapping, nodding with visible relief. It was like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, after the press left and the crowd thinned, Monica met with a small group of residents at our kitchen table. They brought boxes of old notices, photos, emails, proof that Mildred had been abusing her position for a long time. One couple showed a letter where Mildred threatened legal action over a flagpole that was supposedly too patriotic. Another neighbor had a recording of a conversation where she was told to move her mother into a more appropriate community for her condition. Monica's legal team took everything, scanning and categorizing, preparing a formal complaint to the state attorney general. But they weren't just building a case against Mildred, they were building a path forward for every neighborhood that had ever been manipulated by an overreaching HOA. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low behind the roofs, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not just in Monica, though God knows she earned it, but in the people around me, in the way they'd stood up, spoke out, chose to believe in something better. Across the street, I saw a hand-painted sign go up on a neighbor's front lawn: "Community before control." A few doors down, someone added another: "Accessibility is a right, not a violation." And on the ruins of the ramp, a little girl placed a flower. Then her father handed me a note, written in crayon: "Thank you for helping people like my grandma." I smiled, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my shirt pocket. We weren't just rebuilding a ramp, we were rebuilding trust. And this time, we were going to get it right. It didn't take long for everything to fall apart. The morning after Monica's press conference, Mildred's house sat dark and still. No porch light, no blinds twitching, no HOA clipboard patrol at dawn. Her beige sedan remained in the driveway, unmoved, as if even it were too ashamed to show its face. By 9 a.m., the HOA office, just a converted room in the community center, was swarmed with reporters and state officials. Mildred didn't show up, and neither did most of the board members. Only Earl, the quiet accountant, appeared. He arrived, dropped off a plastic bin full of HOA records, and left without saying a word. I heard later he resigned with a one-line email: "I was never comfortable with the way things were run." The other two board members, Marlene and Dave, resigned the next day. Marlene's farewell letter was accidentally CC'd to half the neighborhood. In it, she blamed Mildred for manipulating her and claimed she'd been misled about the financial reporting. Dave's resignation was shorter but just as scathing. He ended it with, "I joined to help the community. I didn't sign up to cover for fraud. The HOA, as we knew it, was collapsing, Monica stayed calm through it all. She didn't celebrate. She didn't post any triumphant social media updates. While the internet called her a hero, she kept meeting with neighbors, working with her legal team, and taking calls from disability rights groups who wanted her input on national housing policy. It was like the ramp's destruction had opened a bigger door, one she'd been waiting to walk through. Meanwhile, our neighbors, many of whom had never spoken more than a wave and a good morning, were now meeting in living rooms, organizing cleanups, sharing resources. There was talk of forming a new HOA board from scratch, this time elected properly, with transparency and actual community involvement. A few folks even suggested doing away with the HOA entirely, though that would take a vote and time. Still, change was happening. One morning, I found a note slipped through our mailbox. No name, just handwriting I recognized from old violation letters. Mildred. It read, "I made mistakes. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I see now I was wrong. I hope in time you'll all move on without resentment. M.A." I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't sure if I felt anger, pity, or both. It didn't matter. What was done was done. She didn't need forgiveness from us. She needed accountability from the law. And that was coming. The state investigation was now officially underway. Mildred had been subpoenaed to testify about her time as HOA president, especially regarding the misused funds and the violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Several residents filed complaints of their own, and Monica's legal team was helping coordinate depositions. And then came the audit results. They were damning. It turned out Mildred had not only funneled HOA money into her home improvements, she'd also charged residents late fees that didn't exist in the charter, pocketing the payments as administrative compensation. No one even knew about the bank account, until Monica's lawyer tracked it down through one of Dave's budget reports. The fallout wasn't just local anymore. A major news network picked up the story. The headline read, "Arizona Governor's Ramp Destroyed by Rogue HOA, Federal Investigation Launched." I couldn't believe it. Our quiet street, our modest house, our little corner of suburban life, it was national news. And yet, as big as the headlines were, it was the smaller changes that hit me hardest. Miss S. Chen started growing her herbs again, this time in colorful planters by her porch. The Bakers put up their son's sensory equipment in the backyard and added a cheerful welcome friends sign to their gate. Mr. Rodriguez invited me over for coffee and told me stories about his father, how he used to sit by the window, watching the neighborhood he helped build, before Mildred made them remove the lift that gave him access to the porch. Even Harold from the end of the street, who once yelled at me about leaf blowers, stopped by with a six-pack and said, "You were right to stand up. It wasn't just vindication, it was healing." That weekend, Monica held a community discussion at the park. No microphones, no banners, just a circle of folding chairs and a box of donuts someone brought from the grocery store. She didn't give a speech. She asked a question. What do we want our neighborhood to be now? People were quiet at first. Then came a few suggestions: less fines, more help for seniors, a neighborhood watch that wasn't about spying on each other, but actually watching out for one another. Someone suggested monthly potlucks. Another offered to build a lending library. I looked around and realized I was seeing something rare: people who had felt powerless beginning to take power back. It wasn't perfect. We still had to rebuild the ramp, still had to elect a new board, still had to sort through legal documents and attend HOA transition meetings. But it was happening. Brick by brick, person by person, we were reclaiming what this place was supposed to be: a community. The rebuild started on a Monday morning, just after sunrise. Not with contractors or a construction crew, but with neighbors. Monica and I stood on the porch with our coffee as people arrived one by one, carrying toolboxes, buckets of paint, even foldable sawhorses. A few brought pastries and breakfast sandwiches. Someone had picked up plywood from the hardware store. Another dropped off a cooler full of bottled water and Gatorade. I didn't recognize half the people, and that didn't matter. The old ramp was gone, bulldozed into rubble and carted off in a flatbed days earlier, but in its place, chalk markings now outlined a new, wider slope. One of the neighbors, Kevin, a retired engineer, had drawn up blueprints after seeing the live stream of the demolition. He said it was the least he could do. This one's gonna be stronger, safer, and better looking, he said with a grin, patting the rolled-up plans like they were sacred scrolls. Monica smiled, but I could see her holding back tears, not because of what had been lost, but because of what was being built, not just in concrete and screws, but in solidarity. I joined the crew as we got to work, lifting boards, mixing cement, hammering supports. People rotated in and out throughout the day. Teenagers helped paint the railing base. 2 older women from the cul-de-sac brought us sandwiches around noon and insisted we take a break, threatening to call our doctors if we didn't sit down for 15 minutes. By the end of the week, the ramp was complete. But this wasn't just any ramp. This one had hand-carved rails with floral details, donated by a local artisan. The slope was illuminated by solar-powered lights that glowed softly at night, creating a warm, golden path. And along the edges, the neighborhood kids had painted a mural of wildflowers and words like hope, welcome, and together. I can't count the number of times I stood at the top of that ramp, just staring down at it, stunned by the fact that something so beautiful had grown from something so cruel. And the change didn't stop at our front door. Across the neighborhood, signs of rebirth were blooming. The once feared violation office at the community center was converted into a resource hub. One of the first initiatives was a volunteer program for helping elderly residents with home repairs. No more threatening letters, just neighbors showing up to fix a railing or repaint a fence. Someone even set up a community support board where people could post requests or offer help rides to the doctor, groceries, help with tech problems. It filled up within 2 days. The HOA, now under interim leadership, hosted a town meeting in the same room where Mildred used to hold closed-door sessions. This time, the doors were wide open, folding chairs filled every inch of the room, and Monica was invited to speak, not as the lieutenant governor, but as a resident. She declined the microphone and just stood at the front, hands folded, calm as ever. "We don't need new rules," she said. "We need new habits, new hearts. We already know how to treat each other better. Let's make that the policy." The vote for the new HOA board was scheduled for the following month. A transparent election with nominations, open forums, and real debate. A handful of neighbors stepped up to run not because they wanted power, but because they wanted to make things right. The candidates included Kevin the engineer, Miss S, Jen, and even young Sarah from the second cul-de-sac, who had only moved in 6 months ago but had become one of the most vocal advocates for reform. And people were talking to each other again. I saw conversations happening at mailboxes, lawn chairs being pulled onto front yards, weekend potlucks, shared tools and recipes. Someone even suggested organizing a neighborhood garden. The mood had shifted from tension to trust. It was small things, really. A smile instead of a glance. An offer instead of a warning. People no longer saw each other as rule breakers, but as humans. One afternoon, as Monica rolled down the new ramp with a coffee in her hand, she paused halfway and turned to me. "Can you believe this started with a concrete ramp?" I nodded. "A ramp and a whole lot of stubbornness." She laughed. "Mostly yours." That night, we hosted a barbecue in the backyard. It wasn't just a "we beat the HOA" celebration. It was a thank you. A gesture of gratitude to everyone who had showed up, spoken out, and stood beside us. Tables were filled with food casseroles, pies, hot dogs, veggie skewers. Kids ran around with glow sticks. One neighbor brought a portable speaker and played old Motown hits. Even Harold, the formerly grumpy leaf blower guy, showed up with a homemade peach cobbler and said, "Let's not fight about leaves this year." Monica gave a short toast. "This ramp was built twice," she said. "Once out of necessity, once out of love. I prefer the second one." Everyone raised their cups, plastic or otherwise. Later that night, When the crowd had thinned and the stars were out, I walked the length of the ramp one more time. The solar lights cast a soft glow on the flower mural. At the top step, someone had left a handwritten note. "This is what community looks like." I folded it up and slid it into my jacket pocket, next to the crayon drawing from the little girl who thanked us for helping her grandma. We hadn't just rebuilt something, we had reimagined it. And in doing so, we rediscovered something we didn't even know we were missing each other. A year later, the ramp still glows every night. It's become something of a landmark in our neighborhood, not just because of how beautifully it was built, or the way the solar lights spill softly across the sidewalk, but because of what it represents. Every time I watch someone slow down to admire it, neighbors, visitors, even kids on bikes, I'm reminded of how far we've come since the morning it was destroyed. Back then, it felt like everything was falling apart. Now, it feels like something solid was built from the wreckage. So much has changed since that day. The new HOA board was elected 6 weeks after Monica's press conference. The voting turnout was the highest in the neighborhood's history. People actually cared this time not just about who would enforce the rules, but about who would protect the people living here. Kevin the engineer was elected president. Miss S. Chen became the new treasurer. Sarah, the young woman who'd only lived here a few months, became secretary. None of them had any desire for power. They just wanted to make sure no one else went through what we did. One of their first actions was to retire all existing fines and strike old violation notices from the record. Then they rewrote the community guidelines to include protections for accessibility, religious freedom, family-based accommodations, and cultural expression. No more arbitrary punishments. No more vague bylaws. Everything transparent, everything fair. And they didn't just stop there. The HOA's new office, once a cold little space filled with folders and warnings, was transformed into a community help center. Now, when someone moves in, they get a welcome basket instead of a list of rules. If someone gets injured or needs home repairs, there's a volunteer program to lend a hand. And every month, there's a community gathering, sometimes a breakfast, sometimes a cleanup, sometimes just a potluck where people share stories. We started becoming neighbors again. And Monica? She didn't slow down one bit. After the press around the ramp reached national headlines, she was invited to speak on disability access and housing fairness at conferences across the country. But she always said the same thing. It's not about the ramp. It's about the people behind the doors it opens. She worked with state lawmakers to draft a new bill, the Homeowner Protection and Accessibility Act. It passed unanimously in the state legislature and was signed into law 6 months ago. It requires all HOAs in Arizona to follow strict transparency rules, bans fines for medical accessibility features, and sets up an independent oversight board residents can contact if they feel harassed or discriminated against. They named the law after her, of course, but she only agreed when they added the subtitle, "A Law for the People," by the neighbors. Funny how one small ramp turned into all of this. I think about that a lot when I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the lights flicker on. I think about how close we were to letting it go, how easy it would have been to give in, to let Mildred win. But we didn't, because Monica refused to be silent, because the neighbors stepped up, because sometimes the worst things bring out the very best in people. Even the old Bulldozer company came around. Turns out, once they learned who ordered the job and how it was carried out, their CEO personally reached out to Monica to apologize. They've since launched a program to build ramps, real ones, for low-income disabled residents across the state, free of charge. They even set up a scholarship fund for students going into disability rights law. One of those scholarship winners? The teenage girl who came to Monica's press conference in her own wheelchair. She's applying to law school this fall. The ripple effects haven't stopped. Last month, I was offered a position heading a new state initiative, the Office of Community Rights and Housing Fairness. It's still surreal to think about. I spent most of my life working behind the scenes, Now I help people navigate the systems that once tried to silence us. We're building toolkits, creating training programs, and teaching other communities how to shift from enforcement to empathy. I guess you could say we're turning HOAs into something useful again. And it's working. Last week, Monica and I hosted a barbecue in the backyard, like we always do in early spring. The ramp glowed in the background, the flowers around it in full bloom. Mr. Rodriguez brought his now famous lemonade. The bakers brought their son, who proudly wore a t-shirt that said, "Rules don't scare me." Kevin gave a speech so short it made everyone laugh. And Sarah passed out flyers about a new mural project going up near the park. Near the end of the night, as the sun dipped low and kids started chasing fireflies, I noticed a moving truck parked across the street. New neighbors, a young family, 3 kids, 2 dogs, and their elderly grandmother, who smiled from the passenger seat as her son helped her out carefully, gently, and with clear practice. A few minutes later, I saw them unloading a ramp from the back of the truck. Aluminum, clean lines, functional, the same kind of ramp that once brought our whole world crashing down. Only this time, something beautiful happened. Instead of whispers or stares, 5 neighbors walked over to help. No questions asked, just hands lifting, holding, guiding. Monica watched from the porch and said nothing, just smiled and nodded. And nobody filed a complaint. Nobody called it an eyesore. Nobody cared about aesthetic disruption. Instead, Mrs. Chen brought over a plate of dumplings. Kevin offered to install lights. And one of the neighborhood kids ran up with a paintbrush and asked, "Can I decorate it too?" That's when I knew we hadn't just rebuilt a ramp. We'd rebuilt what it means to live side by side with grace, with patience, with humanity. And maybe, just maybe, we'd built something strong enough to last. I've lived long enough to know that doing the right thing isn't always easy. But the story of my sister's wheelchair ramp taught me something deeper. When you stand up for what's right, you're not just protecting someone you love, you're inspiring an entire community. As older adults, we sometimes feel like our voices don't carry the same weight anymore. But I've seen firsthand that even a trembling voice can shake the foundations of injustice. We are never too old to make a difference. Whether it's challenging an unfair rule, standing up for a vulnerable neighbor, or simply offering a helping hand, small actions, when rooted in kindness, can transform an entire neighborhood. I didn't need a title or recognition. I just needed to know that I did the right thing and helped leave behind a better place for those who come after us. If this story moved you, please hit like, subscribe, and share this video so others can feel the same hope and strength. It's never too late to be part of something meaningful. Thank you for listening.